Hello, today I will be going over with you the history of ancient Egypt. The source that I will be using today is Ancient Egypt's Everyday Life in the Land of the Nile by Bob Rear and Hoyt Hobbs, written by me, Salih Jamal. Introduction. There are many civilizational achievements in pre-modernity that we look back on in fascination, from the conquests of the Mongols and Macedonians to the infrastructure of the Harappans and the Romans, or the governing of the Abbasids and Achaemenid Persians. However, none of these captivate us as much as the relatively early achievements of the ancient Egyptians. Today we will observe the roughly 3,000-year-long history of ancient Egypt, broken down into 8 segments, starting with the pre-dynastic period. During the pre-dynastic period, the culture of ancient Egypt initially developed between the Mediterranean to the north, the Sahara to the west, the Sinai and the Red Sea to the east, and the Aswan Cataract to the south. By roughly 3000 BC, shared religious beliefs and common language united the people living in this area. Despite being united culturally, though, they still had not been unified under one government. That was until there came a man named Narmer, otherwise known as Menes, who united Lower and Upper Egypt into one polity. Lower Egypt is what we would consider to be the north, and Upper Egypt is what we would consider to be the south. This would be the first of 3 times when Egypt was united, and all 3 times it would be united by someone from the south. Perhaps the reason for this was that Southerners were farther away from more foreign cultures and were thus more nationalistic in the common identity of being Egyptian. The rule of Narmer marked the beginning of the early dynastic period, as he was the first known ruler of a united Egypt, and he was also the first to establish Memphis as the capital of Egypt. Memphis would become a very important part of Egyptian history for centuries to come. The early dynastic period was under the rule of the first 2 dynasties and lasted from 3150 BC to 2686 BC, and it was during this period that people began to develop a belief in their king's divinity. They believed that if their ruler was going to go to the afterlife, they would need the same things that they had during this world, things like food, clothing, and even furniture, and for this reason they would begin the construction of elaborate tombs for their rulers. King Zoser would order the construction of a step pyramid that was 200 feet high, with 6 rectangles stacked on top of each other, made up of bricks, with each rectangle getting smaller to form what we would consider to be the first Egyptian pyramid. The beginning of the Old Kingdom period would be marked by Zoser's start of the Great Age of Pyramids. The Old Kingdom period would see the rule of the 3rd through 6th dynasties and would last from 2686 BC to 2181 BC, and would see the construction of Egypt's most famous pyramids. The Fourth Dynasty's first ruler, Snefru, created the first true pyramid, with slanted sides instead of steps. His son Khufu would build the Great Pyramid in the Giza Plateau. This pyramid would be 481 feet high and be unparalleled in height until the Eiffel Tower's construction in the 19th century. The descendants of Khufu, Khafra and Menkaura, would create the other 2 of the Great Pyramids of Giza. Khafra would also be the one to make the Sphinx. While little is known about the end of the 4th dynasty, we do know that the 5th dynasty saw a religious revolution in which the sun god Ra would become the dominant deity of ancient Egypt. The rulers of the 5th dynasty would be buried 5 miles from Giza and would focus less on pyramids and more on making temples in honor of the sun. They would end up creating 5 large sun temples that would include obelisks meant to symbolize the sun's rays. King Unas, who was either the last of the 5th dynasty or the first of the 6th dynasty, introduced hieroglyphs. These hieroglyphs were known as pyramid texts and were supposed to be magic spells that would help the king have safe passage to the afterlife. During the Old Kingdom period, Egypt could import goods from as far as modern-day Afghanistan and showed military prowess over the Levant, Libya, and Kush. The 6th dynasty would come to an end when the central government of Egypt lost authority under the senile rule of Pepi II. The final ruler of the 6th dynasty would also be the first woman ruler, the daughter of Pepi, Nitokurti. And when she died, the country fell into chaos, marking the end of the Old Kingdom period. In between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom was a period of chaos in Egypt. Manetho, the ancient historian, described over 140 rulers and 4 dynasties during this period, which is relatively short compared to the 500-year-old Old Kingdom period. Lasting from 2181 BC to 2041 BC, during this period, violent crimes such as assault and highway robbery became much more common, as the central authority was losing legitimacy. Smaller positions in the government became hereditary when they were previously appointative. Despite the general political chaos, the lives of the average farmer in the country stayed pretty much as it always was, if not a little more treacherous. From the southern part of Egypt, born to a noble family, Montuhotep I would become the second man in ancient Egyptian history to unite his land and would make the deity that he named himself after, Montu, the falcon god of war, the patron deity of his dynasty. The Middle Kingdom period would last from 2040 BC to 1782 BC, and would see Montuhotep's hometown of Thebes become the capital, as well as the rebounding of construction of grand monuments, with a new central authority to commission them. His tomb would be built on a cliffside and would be very elaborate, including a large garden in front with an orchard, a shrine, a statue of the king, and a tunnel that ran deep inside the cliffs to where his actual tomb was. The 11th dynasty would see 2 more rulers with the name Montuhotep before the 12th dynasty began. When the last Montuhotep's vizier became the ruler, his name was Amenemhat, and the names of the rulers of this dynasty would alternate between his name and that of his fathers, Senusret. This new dynasty would make Amun, a deity known as the Hidden One, to be the chief deity of Egypt, and would establish a new capital called Ittau, which was 10 miles south of Memphis. New pyramids would be constructed in the Middle Kingdom period, although they would only be about 200 feet high. Senusret I would gain ascendancy over the north of Sudan, constructing forts to keep control of Kush's coveted gold. Senusret would commission the construction of the Karnak Temple, which is to this day the largest religious complex in the world. Amenemhat III would inadvertently build a city so complex the Greeks would mistake it for the labyrinth from the story of the Minotaur. Amenemhat IV would perish without a male heir, and so the rulership went to his sister, Sobekneferu, who would rule for 3 years before another period of chaos would erupt in Egypt. The Middle Kingdom period would be looked back on as a grand chapter in Egyptian history. Art such as the depiction of royalty had achieved a certain level of defined realism. The Egyptian language in the Middle Kingdom period had reached a level of prose that would be seen as the benchmark in later years. The Middle Kingdom certainly earned its place as the second great age of ancient Egypt. Egypt would again fall into another dark age, with 3 dynasties with over 160 kings between them, in the period between 1782 BC to 1570 BC. Egypt became vulnerable to the Indo-Europeans, who would conquer Anatolia and would develop into the Hittites, who would become Egypt's major rival for dominance over the Middle East. The Egyptians would come under the heel of foreigners called the Hyksos, translated to foreign kings, and would also experience immigration from Palestine. A family from Thebes would become the 17th dynasty, and they would begin an effort to get Egypt back under native control. One of the rulers of this dynasty, named Kamose, would describe Egypt as being fractured into a minimum of 2 kingdoms, with Kush being ruled by a separate king as well. His relative Ahmose started the 18th dynasty and successfully defeated the Hyksos, even conquering a core part of their territory in Palestine, reunited North and South Egypt, and took back Kush and its gold mines, ushering in the third and last great period of an independently, natively ruled ancient Egypt. The New Kingdom period lasted for a 500-year period from 1570 BC to 1070 BC, and would see Egypt for the first time focusing on expanding outside of the African continent and into the Middle East, with the help of horsepower chariots and bronze, a metal stronger than copper that you get when mixing it with tin. Both of these technologies being gained from their time under the Hyksos. The success of their military endeavors caused the rulers of Egypt, who starting during this period were officially called pharaohs, to raise the status of the city of Thebes to the same level as Memphis when donating temples to Amun, the patron deity of the city. The successor of Ahmose, Amenhotep I, would conquer deeper into Kush. Thutmosis I would also go deeper south, but would conquer the Levant and cross the Euphrates River, gaining influence over Mesopotamia. By the New Kingdom period, the ancient Egyptians caught on that building large and easy to
easy to be noticed tombs, such as pyramids, were only going to be taken as a challenge by tomb raiders. So they began making the tombs of their pharaohs in caves in a place which would come to be called the Valley of the Kings, although even this would not prevent theft from the conniving. One notable ruler and one of the few female rulers of Egypt was Hatshepsut, who was the widow of the last pharaoh and fully embraced her new position, even having statues that depicted her have the pharaonic insignia of a beard. Hatshepsut's rule would, in contrast of her male predecessors, involve no grand military conquests, although her co-ruler and stepson Thutmose III would lead a large army into the Middle East to take back dominance lost during her reign after her death. He would come to be the equivalent of Napoleon to ancient Egypt, with 8 campaigns in the Middle East, capturing many major cities, crossing the Euphrates River, and even having time to go on an elephant hunt where he killed 132 elephants. He is also known for almost completely erasing Hatshepsut's reign from Egyptian history, as she had upset the natural order. Amenhotep IV would bring about a religious revolution in ancient Egypt. Instead of Egyptians worshipping the same pantheon that they had been devoted to for ages at this point, he decided that everyone should worship the sun, which he called the Aten, and changed his own name to Akhenaten, which literally translates to beneficial to the Aten. His heirs who were to rule after him were siblings, a half-sister named Ankhesenamen, and a half-brother who was one of the most famous pharaohs, Tutankhamun or King Tut. It would be under them that the previous religious order would be brought back, although this was really caused by an old vizier named A, as they were both 9 years old at the time. During the 19th dynasty, Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, would rule for 67 years, would attack Egypt's new Middle Eastern rival, the Hittite Empire, and would spend the rest of his reign erecting monuments to boast of his few victories. He would have over 100 children, and he would substitute his name on the monuments of other pharaohs to the point that his name is mentioned more than any other. And he would make the great temple at Abu Simbel, which would include 4 67-foot tall statues of himself carved into the side of a mountain. The 20th dynasty would see Ramses III save Egypt from the Sea People, who had conquered their rival, the Hittites, and would later disperse across the Mediterranean. He would also lead expeditions into Punt in the Horn of Africa, as well as the Sinai for incense and turquoise, respectively. Although problems would emerge during his reign, records show that government officials and even ladies of the harem were plotting to assassinate him. The 20th dynasty ended with Pharaoh Ramses IV through 11th, who mostly only reigned for short terms. The center of power moved away from Thebes and to Tanis, which was a city in the Delta, and around the same time, Egypt slowly began to sink into chaos and decentralization, with more workers' strikes and tomb robberies. Even the high priests of Amun respected the central leadership less and less, wearing the crowns of pharaohs as part of their dress. Egypt would never again be at a greater height than they were at during this period. Their military strength allowed them to wield power over an area quadruple their size and grow extremely wealthy. The late period lasted from 1069 BC to 332 BC, and would see ups and downs. It was at times comparable to the previous intermediate periods, although sometimes saw eras of growth, although not on par with what was seen during the three great ages of ancient Egypt. During this time, they were ruled over by a few dynasties of Libyan descent, as well as the 25th dynasty, which was Kushite. Unfortunately for the Kushites, the Assyrians would conquer Egypt soon after, as they would become the dominant power in the Middle East. The Assyrians would have to face the Babylonians, which would allow Egypt to be ruled over by the native 26th dynasty, which hailed from the delta city of Site. Necho II would attempt to re-strengthen the Egyptian economy with a project to build a canal that would link the Red Sea and Mediterranean Sea. He also planned to commission a fleet of Phoenician ships to go around Africa, but chaos would strike before either of those two projects could get underway. Egypt would face threats from the Phrygians, the Medes, and the Babylonians, with Nebuchadnezzar defeating Necho at the Battle of Carchemish in Syria, and later besieging Jerusalem and taking its citizens back to Babylon after defeating the pharaoh Apries. Both the Egyptians and the Babylonians would be conquered by the Medo-Persian Achaemenid Empire. Egypt would gain independence for a brief 61 years before being conquered by Alexander the Great, who defeated the Persians and was proclaimed pharaoh. After Alexander's death, his empire would be split amongst his generals, and Ptolemy would rule Egypt, with Egypt now being ruled by Greek rulers that did not mix with the native population. Finally, the famed Cleopatra would become romantically involved with first Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony, which would eventually lead to the Roman Caesar Octavian conquering Egypt when both Cleopatra and Mark Antony committed suicide, marking the end of ancient Egyptian history, as Egypt was now a province of the Roman Empire. In conclusion, ancient Egypt is one of the most fascinating civilizations of the ancient world. They had a 3,000-year-long history with many high points, conquests, and grand moments, and great rulers, as well as times when they themselves were subjugated and went through periods of chaos and decline. Ancient Egypt can be used as an example for civilization, showing that no matter how long your time in the sun, you will eventually fall back to earth.